Welcome to Taking the Higher Road, a DriverReach and FreightWaves production. I'm your host, Jeremy Reymer, founder and CEO of DriverReach, a modern recruiting and compliance software solution. On this show, I interview industry experts and thought leaders who bring their insights to the driver lifecycle as we discuss the industry's greatest challenges, driver recruiting and retention. I appreciate all the positive feedback on the show. Please remember to rate and review Taking the Higher Road, whatever platform you use to listen. This week, I'm excited to be hosting, once again, a great friend and someone who's become my go-to person for all things safety and compliance, Brandon Wiseman, owner and president of Trucksafe Consulting. So glad to have you back on the show, Brandon.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for having me again.
Well, I always enjoy chatting with you because I get to geek out a little bit on compliance. And I don't get to do that, with just about anyone. But I'm excited to catch up with you on some new developments with the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. We could talk about the improvements made there, as well as discuss how the Clearinghouse is doing the job it was intended to do. And then perhaps we can also consider suggestions on how it could be even better. I'd also like to share with the audience a first-of-its-kind event that you're putting on, an immersive 2-day fleet compliance boot camp. That's April 19th and 20th in Indianapolis. I'd like to hear more about that and what's on the agenda and so on. And then lastly, I'd like to make sure we get to one of our listeners' questions during our deeper dive segment. Does that work for you?
Let's do it.
Sweet. All right. Well, to kick things off, I often ask my guests for a book recommendation, but I know you're a podcast guy. Now, I may have thrown you for a loop. You may have been thinking I'm going to have to share some book thing. And if you do, that's okay. You can share that too. But I know you're a podcast guy and you have your own podcast called Trucksafe Live, and you're no stranger to this show. So can you share with the audience maybe your favorite podcast besides Trucksafe Live and Taking the High Road, of course?
My favorite podcast is the Joe Rogan podcast, just because I know that's the easy out. But there's those episodes, as most will know, are just so packed full of interesting and good discussion on a lot of very different topics. So that's my favorite podcast. More recently, I've been kind of sucked into whatever my wife's listening to, which is usually some kind of true crime podcast or something like that. So that's what I've got.
What is it with wives and crime? They're all plotting our demise, I think. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, I always have to sleep with one eye open.
Right. So well, you're an attorney. You specialized in all things FMCSA. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that. So, I think I still have a license.
Yes. And you worked for many years for a well-known law firm that has a large trucking practice. What was it that led you to, go out on your own and start Trucksafe Consulting? Aside from the entrepreneurial itch, which I absolutely understand.
Yeah, that was kind of the main driving force. But I wanted to do more content on DOT compliance issues. I had a background in production and marketing before I went to law school. So kind of got diverted from that path, going to law school, which I got a lot of great experience working for the firm and met a lot of great folks in the industry, really got sucked into the industry there. But then at the, 2021, early 2021, felt the need and desire to create more content. I just didn't think there was that great of content out there that is directed specifically to safety managers, safety directors, small trucking companies about DOT compliance and how to interpret these regulations, which can be complex in certain situations, and how to apply them to your fleet. I did that in my capacity as an attorney for many years, working with fleets of all types and sizes. I just felt like I was in a good position to be able to offer that. So that's what I did, and I have been doing it for a couple of years now. It's been fun.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. I love working with you, and for all those same reasons. I agree with you. I think you hit the nail on the head. There is a dearth. Is that a word? A dearth of content out there. I think that's a word. And I think I said it in its actual contextual.
I think so. Yeah.
But that's the reality. And so, and there are so many people who I think who are hungry for that information and want it, but might not go through the extra effort to get it.
Yeah. I mean, the benefit I had was, if I'm a safety director for a fleet, I have usually specific issues that I deal with day in and day out. There may be other issues that I never have to deal with or just very rarely. But in my capacity working with hundreds and thousands of fleets over the years, I got to see a lot of different issues come up in different situations. So I got to experience how the regulations work and how they're interpreted in all of these different contexts, so that now when you're the fleet that's dealing with these specific narrow set of circumstances, and all of a sudden you're forced to have to interpret a particular component of the regulations that you're not used to. I think that's something that we have to offer through TruckSafe, is kind of our perspective on those types of issues.
And you've seen so much of it. Now, I want to talk about the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. It's something, obviously, it's now 3 years. We had its recent 3-year anniversary, right, in January of this year. I've been a huge supporter of the concept of this clearinghouse ever since I first heard that it was even being considered by the FMCSA. And I think that was like 18 plus years ago. At least that's when I first heard about it. And now that it's here and it's fully operational with 3 years of previous data, let's just talk about how it's going. In your opinion, is the clearinghouse doing the job it was intended to do?
It's definitely doing the job that it was intended. I mean, the whole purpose of the clearinghouse is to centralize the data that was kind of all over the place about the drug and alcohol testing history of CDL drivers. I mean, historically, what we had to do as regulated carriers was reach out to previous employers for the drivers, the CDL drivers that were onboarding, and ask them questions about whether that particular driver had ever tested positive for drugs and alcohol. And we were reliant on the representations that we received from those previous employers. Sometimes we never received a response. So we were always kind of shooting in the dark. So the whole purpose of the clearinghouse is let's get that all in a central database so that it's out there and available for all to see. And we can be confident in our vetting of CDL drivers as to whether they are prohibited from operating because of a drug and alcohol testing violation or not. So it is certainly doing its job in that regard. FMCSA publishes its numbers. It had been publishing them every month. They've fallen a little bit behind. So just looking at the numbers here of how many positive test results they've had. December of 2022 is the last report that they have available on their website. It looks like 2022 there were a total of 68,639 drug and alcohol violations reported to the clearinghouse. Most of those were marijuana use. But what's shocking to me, we've talked about these numbers, I know, on prior episodes, but this is the latest data. As of December of 2022, there are currently 120,345 drivers, CDL drivers, in prohibited status, meaning they are prohibited from operating a commercial motor vehicle because they've had a drug or alcohol testing violation and they haven't completed that regulatory return to duty process to get things cleared up. So
that's significant. And that number, by the way, I remember even before the clearinghouse was a thing, the ATA had published an $80,000 or 80,000 driver shortage number.
yeah.
And that's not including that then.
The last time we talked, the number of prohibited drivers was right around that 80,000 number.
Right.
So we were saying at that time during that show, it kind of tracked the number of drivers that we are short. Now it's outpaced the numbers that the ATA estimates that we're short. We're at 120, in excess of 120,000 drivers in prohibited status. So just crazy numbers.
Well, and how, just from a clearinghouse standpoint, it's a part of everybody's process, or it's supposed to be. It has to be. I mean,
if you got CDL drivers, it's supposed to be part of your process.
Yeah. Now, so has it hindered in any way, do you think, the carrier's ability to hire drivers faster or more efficiently? Because it's an added step and part of the process, and it's certainly not efficient. It's not horrible, but it could be better.
I would say it only hinders the carriers that were comfortable using prohibited drivers in the past. But for carriers that are trying to do the right thing and follow the rules, I think it makes their job a little bit easier, because now we're not having to chase down this information from prior carriers that we probably may never even hear from. And so now we can be a little more confident in our, like I said, driver vetting, making sure that with the drivers we have are actually able to legally operate.
Well, and part of the maybe the efficiency part I'm referring to is not so much the step of pinging the clearinghouse, but it's to do that, to run a pre-employment full query. I'm at the mercy of the driver,
True.
accessing it, hitting, accept, and so on, and making sure that I can get access to that information.
I think that's probably the biggest hang up that I hear from my clients, is getting the drivers to do that step. But if they want a job, they got to do it. So you're not getting a job unless you do it. I mean, it's kind of similar to, when we have a driver fill out an application in the old days, and even still, you got to have them fill out they got to give consent to
Hmm.
run these background checks. And it's essentially what we're doing here. We just want to make sure that the driver is giving their consent for us to ping the clearinghouse. So it's just part of the process. But yeah, maybe that adds a little time and headache to the process.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd say, it's pretty manual. Someone has to go internally, or or they outsource it to another
Yeah.
vendor. But there's not a direct API integration directly into the clearinghouse, and so I'd say that what would certainly make it more faster
Yeah.
and more efficient.
I think so. I think if we could get an API where third parties like DriverReach could just be able to, on behalf of their clients, get that done more efficiently, I think that would even make the system even more useful. But we'll see.
So early on, like right before January of 2020, when the clearinghouse was first getting rolled out, there were a number of shortcomings, and I think there was a lot of feedback. But I remember, I can't remember why it wouldn't or couldn't operate more like today's driver monitoring, where you could get notified if something changed. But I was encouraged to learn that they did make some recent adjustments along those lines. Can you explain, what's changed recently to give better insight into
Yeah.
the drivers?
Yeah, just within the last month or so, this has happened. So, like you said, Clearinghouse has now been in effect for over 3 years. January 6th, our favorite date was the was the anniversary of the Clearinghouse. 3 years in, and so one of the things that a lot of folks had pointed out that was missing with the system was its inability um, to update carriers on the status of a driver after they had run one of the required queries. So, folks who use the clearinghouse will know that there are two types of queries that you're required to run. When you're first onboarding a CDL driver, you have to run what's called a full query, or some call it a pre-employment query. That is the type of query that you and I were just discussing, where the driver has to give their specific consent by logging into their own clearinghouse account and saying, you can do this. And then carriers also have, after they hire the driver, they have an obligation to once every 12 months run what's called a limited query on all of their existing drivers to see if anything about that driver's status has changed in the system. And what we had was a problem where the minute I run one of those limited queries, it's going to tell me whether that driver is good to go or not. But the minute after I run it, if anything about that driver's status changed, then I wouldn't know about it necessarily unless the driver told me about that. And we all know we can't always rely on the drivers to tell us when something bad has happened. Um, and we would potentially be blind to it until the next year, 12 months later, when we ran the next limited query on that driver. So there was nothing in the system notifying us if anything about the driver's status changed. Well, FMCSA has heard those criticisms about the system, and they've changed that within the last month. So now, effective a few weeks ago from when we're recording this podcast, now the system will notify you anytime you run a query, whether it's a full query at the onboarding stage or a limited query. If anything about the driver's status changes within the 12 months after you run that query, you will get a notification through your clearinghouse account that, hey, there's new data in the system about the driver. We're not telling you what that new data is. That would be too easy, I think. So we make you go through one more step, which is to say that if you get one of those notifications that there's been a change in the driver's status, you then have to go run a new full query, meaning now you got to get that driver's consent again, and you have to see what has changed about that driver's status. Are they now in prohibited status, meaning you have to remove them from safety sensitive functions, or maybe something else has changed that doesn't necessarily disqualify them. Maybe they have completed a follow-up testing schedule for the return to duty process. Probably less common, but the point is that if you get one of those notices that something has changed, you've got 24 hours now to run a full query on that driver and see what it is. Is the driver prohibited or not?
So I might want to unpack that a little bit more. So first of all, it's encouraging that it works for the pre-employment full query as well as periodic limited queries, because there was a change, I think, early on where they said for full queries, for pre-employment full queries, we'll let you know after, I don't know if it was like 60 days or 90 days or something.
It was
Maybe it
30
was 6
days.
months. Was it 30? Okay.
Yeah. So I should have mentioned that, but yeah, with the full queries, there was a little bit of a tail to it. even under the old rules. So if you ran a full query within the first 30 days after you ran that full query, the system would notify you if anything changed. But that still left that gap of after 30 days, now we don't have to run a new query for another 12 months, 11 months and however many days, 15, no, forget it. I'm terrible at math. Nobody told me there would be math involved. But anyway, you would still be left blind to their status changes even after a full query, even though it was notifying you within those first 30 days.
Well, and the issue I always had then is you only, I mean, you're going to perform a full query on every driver that you're trying to hire, but you don't hire every driver that you're trying to hire. And so what about all of the limited queries that you're running? These are your actual drivers.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that were way more important for me to get some sort of notification or both. It seems like both now, right?
Now, on the other side of that, though, your existing drivers, you would think that it would be rare where their status would change. So when you're onboarding drivers, they may be working for another motor carrier. So there's a good chance that something could change within that first 30 days after you ran that query, because maybe they test positive at the motor carrier that they're currently working for. Whereas your current drivers, the idea, I think, was we, as the employing motor carrier, should know if their status changes because we're going to hear about a positive test result. But it doesn't take into account situations where maybe they're working for another motor carrier that you don't even know about. Maybe they test positive over there. So there was certainly a gap, but I think the rationale was, hey, maybe we should have greater visibility because they are employed by us and subject to our drug and alcohol testing program at that point.
Yeah, where it happens, certainly if they fail a drug test for me, I'm going to know, right? If they're my employee, but it's when they're testing for a pre-employment somewhere else, and that could be happening all the time, especially with turnover the way it is. So that's the biggest reason why I think it's important. So there's this follow-on full query, and the fleet does not need to pay for that, right? That's free of charge in that scenario.
Yeah. Merry Christmas from FMCSA. You don't get charged again for having to run that full query as a follow-up query.
But any other rules? Because I know you said within 24 hours. Do I need to remove that driver from any sort of safety-sensitive function immediately, or
the rules don't require you to remove them immediately? I always think it's a good idea because you have no idea what's in that system. And it's likely, I would say in most cases, going to be that they are now in prohibited status. And so if I get that notification, even if the regulations don't tell me I have to, I'm taking that driver out of the seat immediately because there's a good chance that he's now prohibited. He's got a drug and alcohol testing violation, and I now know about it. I'm on notice that there's a problem. So from a risk mitigation standpoint, I'm pulling them out immediately. Technically, the rules give you up to that 24 hours. They say that if you don't run that follow-on query within 24 hours, at that point, then you have to remove them from safety-sensitive functions. But
and they have to grant consent still. So that's a whole nother layer. They could, refuse to do that, and that would create a whole nother set of problems. But in all cases, you're still talking about removing from safety-sensitive function.
Yeah, and then if they don't give you their consent to run that full query, then they're going to be prohibited anyway. So it does them no benefit to withhold consent in that situation because either way, whether you find out they're in prohibited status or they refuse to give you consent, they can't drive after that point. So,
and I would imagine the chances of the reason being anything other than a positive, some change in status is probably pretty low.
Probably. I mean, more often than not, it's going to be they're now in prohibited status, either because they tested positive or they refused to test. Those are the most common. But it could be other situations. I mentioned one where they finished maybe they were subject to a follow-up testing schedule. They're in that return to duty process. So they're good to operate. But now the status has changed that they finished that follow-up testing procedure. So that's what the system is telling you is new in the system. So it very well could be a situation where you run the follow-up query and it just turns out. I mean, that would be best case scenario.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's probably best case.
Yeah. But although in that situation, I don't know that I would want to just be finding out right then and there that they've been subject to a follow-up testing schedule. It would have been nice to have known that ahead of time. But
yeah, well, at the end of the day, I think it's a great help in providing better visibility into the quality of drivers that we're hiring. Minimizing risk is all the rage these days, especially as the economy appears to be softening. A good friend, I think Max Farrell from Workout, he recently shared with me that he's noticing people no longer have the fear of missing out. Now they more have the fear of messing up, and safety and compliance are really at the heart of that.
Well, we all know the terrible things that can happen if you mess this stuff up. We've seen this in the $1 million and $1 billion cases that have been lodged against trucking companies, primarily because they have screwed up something when it comes to compliance. So the stakes are pretty high here.
Well, with the time that we have left, I think it's good to switch gears and talk about the special 2-day event you've got coming up this spring in Indianapolis. What is the Fleet Compliance Bootcamp?
Yeah, our boot camp. So this is one of the ways that we wanted to deliver content. So up to this point, we've all done this kind of virtually. So we do our monthly podcast. You mentioned TruckSafe Live. We have our TruckSafe Compliance Network, which is like a social network for safety professionals to learn from one another. But we wanted to do something in person as well and spend more time really digging into the nitty gritty of DOT safety regulations. So the way that we're going to do that is through our TruckSafe Fleet Compliance Boot Camp, which we're going to try and put on a couple of times each year. Our first one is coming up, as you mentioned, in Indianapolis, April 19th through 20th. It's a 2-day conference where we're going to gather together with a small group of safety professionals. We still got some room available if anybody's interested. Trucksafebootcamp.com, shameless plug. But we're going to gather together and we're going to spend 2 days going through these types of topics that we're talking about: drug and alcohol testing, driver qualification, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, all that fun stuff, CSA scores, and really hone in on what it takes to effectively manage a fleet compliance program and keep you out of the crosshairs, both at the DOT, on the DOT side of things, and also highway accident litigation. So really looking forward to it. Should be a great event. Would love to have you there joining with us.
So I know there's limited attendance, and I know that you really want to focus on content quality. What's the site again, just for folks to be able to go and look at it, and register?
Trucksafebootcamp.com. You'll find all the information, hotel information, registration information, a breakdown of what we're going to be talking about, that type of stuff. So check it out.
So Indy's a fun place to be, by the way, in the spring especially. It's the thaw is it's not nearly as cold here as it is in other places. If you remember the Super Bowl we had here, I don't know, 2011 or so, 2012, I think it might have been. But it let everybody think that, wow, Indy, it was like 70 degrees.
Yeah.
You're like, man.
False advertisement, really. No, it should be great. I mean, Indy, you and I, Jeremy, are both from the area, but so we're a little biased, but it's a great city to just walk around in. The boot camp's going to be right downtown on the Circle, so plenty to do downtown. So check it out.
Yeah. Thank you. That'll be exciting. I'll be there for sure. And I look forward to seeing some of the other folks there as well. Great networking opportunity as well as educational opportunity.
For sure.
So let's get into the deeper dive question. This is something that, since you're the safety and compliance expert here, I know I get a lot of these types.
That's Jeremy's term. If the Bar Association is listening in, I did not call myself an expert. Jeremy told me that.
Fair. Now I'm going to get sued. Thanks. So the deeper dive question is a safety related question, and I don't get to use these questions when these come in from listeners. I don't get to use them on recruiting folks because they might not be as well versed. But in this case, the question is, what are the changes to CSA that I've heard are coming? Is that something you can expand on?
Sure. So the FMCSA, CSA, we know this system. It's been in place since 2010. It's essentially a scoring system, or at least the safety measurement system, SMS, which is part of CSA. It's a system we all know as CSA scores or SMS scores, where the FMCSA is kind of measuring every regulated motor carrier's performance, safety-related performance across 7 categories, which are known as the basics currently. And they are giving you a percentile score in each of those 7 basics that is essentially saying how you're performing relative to your peers, other motor carriers with similar number of inspections with violations in those categories. And then those scores are used by the FMCSA primarily to prioritize motor carriers for enforcement. So the carriers that are performing the worst, relatively speaking, to their peers are going to be higher on the FMCSA's list for a potential audit or civil penalties or warning letters, that type of stuff. But it's also an important system because others are looking to the data and using that data against you. Namely, commercial auto liability insurance companies are using it to help set your premiums for your auto liability insurance. The plaintiff's bar is using it when they are figuring out if you're a good target for litigation, and others are using it as well. So it's important that you keep those metrics in check. And so we've had this system largely unchanged since 2010. FMCSA came out within the last few weeks here and has proposed pretty substantial revisions to the system in the way that motor carriers are scored. Why are they doing this? Because the U.S. Congress told them they have to do this. There's been a lot of criticism of the system over the years, folks not thinking that the data is all that useful in predicting crash risk. And so Congress stepped in, told FMCSA they needed to commission a study of the system and its usefulness, and then to implement any recommendations from that study. Study's done, recommendations were made. FMCSA is now taking the next step of modifying the system, not necessarily in the way that we thought they were going to do, but that's really kind of beyond the scope of this discussion. But they are proposing, I would say probably 5 to 6 pretty substantial changes. We've got a whole video on this if you're interested on TruckSafe website, but generally speaking, some of the big ones, they're reorganizing those basics that I mentioned. Number one, we're not going to call them basics. That stands for something. I always forget what it stands for. Now I don't have to remember it. Thank God. We're going to call them safety categories, which is what they are. So we're going to have safety categories. We're still going to have 7 of them, but we're going to reorganize them. So right now, for example, we've got a drug and alcohol basic that's going away, and that's going to be incorporated into our existing unsafe driving basic. So that leaves 6. Where's the 7th one? We're taking our existing vehicle maintenance category and we're splitting it out into 2, a vehicle maintenance and a vehicle maintenance driver observed. So vehicle maintenance was a big category, a lot of violations going into it, just hard to manage that amount of data that's in the system. It's not all that useful in telling us what we need to know about the genesis of the violations. So by splitting it out into categories, the idea is that the information that we're gleaning from the system should be more useful to us in determining the root cause. So that's a big one. We're also talking about changing up the way we do severity weights. There are like 1,000 violations that filter into this system. These are all coming from roadside inspections. There's like 1,000 potential ways your driver can be written up in a roadside inspection. We're still going to have 1,000 ways that they could be written up, but we're going to group them into like-kind violations to make it a little easier, again, to understand the root causes of these violations. If the driver has like 6 hours of service violations, now those are like an 11-hour, 14-hour, 70-hour violations. Under the current system, those would be written up as 3 separate violations. Under the proposed changes, we're going to categorize those all into one category, understanding that what we need to know as the carrier to get that under control is that the driver's having an hours of service problem. We don't care how many ways it's documented on the report. We care more about what's the underlying issue that's causing problems. So that's the other big change. There, like I said, there are a few more, but again, check out our video on the topic if you're interested in the details.
Well, not only that, it sounds like this is good fodder for a good webinar coming up. You know, it's a lot of good information. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brandon. As always, I enjoy our conversations. Really appreciate your friendship, your guidance, and your passion for making this a better and safer industry.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
And thanks for joining me for another episode of Taking the High Road and for spreading the word to your industry peers. We really appreciate it. Remember, you can submit any questions or comments, including those which may appear on upcoming deeper dive segments at podcast@driverreach.com. And don't forget to rate and review Taking the High Road, whatever platform you use to listen. Until next time, thank you for taking the high road.